Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Revolution 250 podcast. I'm Bob Allison. I chair the Rev 250 Advisory Group. We are a consortium of about 75 organizations in Massachusetts planning commemorations of the beginnings of American independence. And our guests today are two historians from the Cape and Islands Historians Committee, David Martin from Barnstable, who is the chair of this illustrious group, and Ron Peterson, who's the chair of the Orleans Historic Commission, and they have collaborated on a book, The Revolutionary War on Cape Cod and the Islands, Issues, Events, and the People, a great resource on the history of the revolution on Cape Cod. So David and Ron, thanks so much for joining us.
Glad to be here.
Thank you for having us, Bob.
So a lot of things were happening on the Cape at the time of the Revolution, and your book really covers a lot of these great stories. And we could basically start anywhere. Why don't you tell us how the Cape and Islands Historians Committee came into being?
Well, it goes back to 2.5 years when actually Ron Peterson and I were chatting about the upcoming 250th anniversary, and we realized that although there's been other writings about Cape and the Islands in the Revolutionary period, it's somewhat unorganized, and a lot of it is 19th century. And we made the idea that there needed to have a single volume that would draw all these together. And so we proceeded and were able to get something like 24 different contributors, and the result is something that has come out this year. So it's been quite an effort.
And it's a work in progress. I think at this stage we have the perception that we've only scratched the surface. So we're continuing to work on it.
Yeah. I mean, we're always learning new things. What was the most surprising thing you learned in the course of doing the book?
I think one of the most surprising things that I learned was about the wreck of the William, which was very few people, and I've lectured on this throughout the Cape, and very few people seem to know about it. But the William was actually the fourth tea ship that was bound for Boston Harbor after the Tea Act was passed in 1773, and it was it was destined for Boston, but it wrecked off the coast of Provincetown, and it contained 58 chests of tea. The crew was able to get all of the tea plus 300 street lamps that were headed for Boston.
John Rose Street
lamps. and that tea that ended up on the shore of Provincetown ended up causing turmoil and consternation throughout the Cape for months to come. And it's a story.
What was troublesome then about the tea landing in Provincetown?
Well, one of the problems was that, believe it or not, the consignee, the British East India Company consignee, Richard Clark and Sons, was actually able to get almost all of the tea, 55 chests of the tea, to Boston, and Governor Hutchinson stored it in Castle Island. And that's a whole story in and of itself, how that happened. But there remained basically 3 chests of tea that caused all of the consternation. And there was an individual from Wellfleet named John Greenough. Greenough was the Justice of the Peace. He was a merchant. He knew Richard Clark and that company and had done business with them. He was also involved in the salvage of shipwrecks, and he was the first official on the scene of the wreck. And what he did was he took a statement from the captain, Captain Loring, who was a young guy, 21 years old. And he was the son of a loyalist from Boston. But then he started he hired local merchant or local laborers to get the tea off the ship on and into Provincetown, where it could be hopefully shipped to Boston. Sometime during that period, Jonathan Clark, the son of Richard Clark and part of the consignee, arrived on the scene, and he assisted. So they got the tea to Provincetown, but they were not able to get any Provincetown sea captains to carry the tea to Boston. They were all patriots, apparently, and wanted nothing to do with the cursed tea. They did carry the street lamps to Boston, but not the tea. So the tea did end up in Boston, much to the consternation of the Patriot leadership in Boston. They were very upset that the Cape Codders didn't do the right thing and destroy the tea.
Yeah.
But that tea ended up in Boston, and John Greenough ended up with 2 chests of tea, which he intended to sell. And I think from the biography and the different roles that I described Greenough playing, I think he's what you would call today, in today's language, a person that had conflicts of interest. He was a patriot, and his father was a leading patriot. In fact, his father was a member of the Boston Committee of Correspondence. So he was somewhat conflicted, but he felt very strongly that that he had a right to sell the tea that he had salvaged because it hadn't been taxed. This was tea that hadn't been taxed. Now, people throughout the Cape, and I think throughout the colonies, had very widely varying opinions about this. Some felt that tea was just an anathema. You don't touch any tea, you don't buy any tea, you don't sell any tea. It's an anathema to the patriotic cause. There were others at the other end of the spectrum who believed differently. They loved their tea. Tea was a very popular drink. And if it wasn't taxed, it wasn't subject to an illegal tax, an unconstitutional tax, then it was okay to sell it. So Greenough takes the tea and he sells it. He sells 1 chest or almost a chest to Stephen Atwood in Provincetown, and he sells part of another chest to Colonel Willard Knowles in Eastham, who was the head of the militia there. And there was all kinds of reactions to the tea, so violent reactions in some cases. Individuals who were known to have tea were stopped on the road, and the tea was taken and scattered on the road. Atwood's house was raided by individuals in disguises, and the tea was taken out, and some of it was burned.
Wow.
Some of it was actually ended up in Lyme, Connecticut. I'm not exactly sure how that happened, but it did.
But a tea burning in Provincetown.
There was a tea burning, and every house in Provincetown was raided, and tea was searched for. So it was they were really turbulent times.
Ron, do we know whereabouts the William wrecked on the beach, on the shore?
It was right off of Peak Hill Bars.
Okay.
In almost the same location as the Somerset.
Interesting.
A graveyard for ships.
Really is. Days. Yeah. Interesting. And the beams of the Somerset resurfaced a couple of years ago. For the first time since
2010, I think.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Yeah, they've resurfaced 3 times.
Yeah. We'll come back to that, I think, because this is kind of a great beginning of this story. And you have these folks in the different towns with different pieces of this these episodes on the Cape. So, David, you vetted the volume. Any things that really stand out to you as things you are glad you know or glad are now in the hands of a wider public?
Well, like Ron, of course, I found a few surprises. One of the ones that really engaged me was the so-called Battle of Falmouth, which is one of the few actual conflicts that occurred on Cape Cod soil that involved, in an indirect way, the islands. And that occurred in April of 1779, when a group of British Marines and sailors, and particularly ship captains, decided that they would like to burn Falmouth because Falmouth had fought back when the British went ashore and raided and slaughtered cattle for food and vegetables. And so the result was that they were overheard by a loyalist host on Pasque Island that they were plotting tomorrow to burn Falmouth. And this was off of next door to Norshon Island in the Elizabeth Islands. Now, this loyalist host, even though he was a loyalist, thought to himself that the poor people of Falmouth were defenseless. And so at night, he sent his 9-year-old son to row 4 miles in the dark, no GPS or compass, back to Woods Hole to alert the militia of Falmouth. They got themselves together, 200 of them, and went and reinforced sand embankments on the beach and hid behind them with muskets. And when the British ships began to lob firebombs onto Falmouth, they fizzled because the ground was just thawing. And then they jumped off of their boats and were ready to attack the shore when the militiamen rose up and fired 2 volleys from their muskets. And that changed the mind of the British, and they went off to Nonamesset Island instead. So that was the Battle of Falmouth.
And it's not an insignificant force. There are a couple of schooners, 8 sloops. I mean, this is a big force coming to attack Falmouth.
Yes, accounts vary between 9 or 10 British ships that were gathered together in Tarpaulin Cove of Norshon Island on that occasion. Yes.
Well, and then John Slocum is the tavern keeper who sends his son to. And do you know anything more about what happens to the Slocums subsequently?
I don't know anything further about that. There was a children's story that was written a few years ago about the boy at his feats, and it's held up as a kind of a wonderful example of young person's heroism.
Right. Well, it is. I mean, a 9-year-old rowing 4 miles in the dark is pretty impressive.
Yeah, it is indeed.
So we have, the Cape is a maritime place, and Ron, you were talking a little bit earlier about the wreck of the Somerset, and there's a lot of mythology about the Somerset, and you've untangled a lot of it and have given us a better story of what the Somerset was doing there and what happens to the crew and so on. Want to tell us what happens with the Somerset?
Sure. Well, the Somerset wrecked in just about the same place as the William. No remains have ever been found of the William, but as we mentioned earlier, the Somerset resurfaced several times since the wreck. But the mythology that you refer to is that the Somerset was said to have been located in Provincetown Harbor. The province, actually, the Somerset played significant roles in the early days of the war. Right. In April of 1775, it was located right in a strategic location. Paul Revere had to row past the Somerset to begin his ride. and he was able to get by unnoticed. The ship's logs showed nothing unusual happening that night. And then it was in a great position to cover the retreat of the British forces after Lexington and Concord.
Mhm.
And the head, Admiral Graves, the head of the British Navy in the colonies, said that if it wasn't for the Somerset, it would have been an absolute disaster, and the war probably would have taken a much different course.
Well, of
And
course,
then
the admiral will say that his ship prevented the army from making a complete disaster.
yes, it was a little bit of probably a little bit of internal politics there going on as well. But it was the Somerset then was also part of the covering fire during the Battle of Bunker Hill. Now the legend says that the Somerset was stationed in Provincetown after that, and was based there, and that the crew members would go on shore and take what they wanted. That mothers were warning their children to be careful of these people, and the black-bearded Captain Orry, the evil person. The legend was that Captain Orry would send his chaplain onto the shore to preach that disloyalty to the king was sinful. So there was all this legend about the Somerset. There was a researcher named Marjorie Hubble Gibson, who wrote a great research, did a biography of the Somerset, did extensive research, found all the logs and logs of other ships. None of that I just mentioned is true. After Bunker Hill, the Somerset was mainly down in the New Jersey, New York area, engaged in a number of different documented operations. And at the time that it wrecked, it was on its way back out to sea to try to intercept the French fleet. Another part of the legend that isn't true, the legend says that the ship's doctor, Dr. Thayer, ended up staying in Provincetown and marrying a Truro woman and living there and practicing. Totally untrue. Dr. Thayer had been in Truro all his life. He was the doctor. So just another part of the legend. It's the way history works sometimes. But these legends were repeated by noted historians of Cape Cod. But so we have, we now know the truth that the Somerset was not guilty. But it did in fact wreck, and 460. There were 480 crew members that attempted to come ashore. One boat capsized, and all 20 some people on that boat were lost. But the first boat in carried a lieutenant who surrendered to the Truro militia. The second boat carried Captain Orry, and then boat after boat came in with the crew members. And as I mentioned in the chapter, I guess the principle that the captain is the last one leaving a sinking ship didn't apply to the
not to Captain Orry.
Not to Captain Orry. But then the citizens at Truro, and Truro was very small at the time, provided care to the 480 some crew members, and then the next day they started marching the prisoners through the entire Cape to Boston. And each town's militia met the procession at the border of the towns, carried them through the towns. At nighttime, the towns would provide care for the prisoners. All the towns were reimbursed later by the legislature for the care that they provided to the prisoners. And they were taken to Boston, where they were involved in prisoner exchanges. And Captain Ory and his lieutenant were sent to Providence, where they were exchanged. And Captain Ory was court-martialed, as was standard practice for when a captain loses a ship. And he was exonerated of any malfeasance or wrongdoing, and was given a command of another ship. So the year on Cape Cod.
Yes, David.
I just wanted, Ron, would you say the year again when the wreck occurred?
Let me make sure I get that straight. 1778.
Yes. Yeah.
And you can see the cannon from the Somerset in the Pilgrim Memorial and Pilgrim Monument Museum in Provincetown. I'm sure there are other pieces of it around. In fact, I have a small piece of wood that is said to be from the Somerset that someone cut off in the 1880s.
And there's actually a piece of wood in the Longfellow house from the Somerset that was presented by a Provincetown official. It would be, and that was given in recognition of Longfellow's poem, but that is, I understand, still on display there. And there's a historical marker to the Somerset at the National Seashore Visitor Center.
Yeah, when it's resurfaced about 15 years ago, they marked the spot, and I went out to see it, and from a distance, I mean, it didn't look that big, but this is just actually the timbers from the very bottom of the hull. But pacing it off, that was about 20 yards across, so it was a substantial ship.
Oh yeah.
Right. Yeah, we're talking with David Martin and Ron Peterson from the Cape and Islands Historians Committee, and they have written a book, edited a book, and Ron and both have done a lot of the writing of it on the Revolutionary War on Cape Cod and the islands. Speaking of the islands, I mean, Nantucket does figure in your book as well, and Nantucket is really divided at this time. And as again, you've kind of sorted out myth and history in it. Want to talk a little bit about what's happening on Nantucket during the Revolutionary War?
Yes, Nantucket is really quite an exception to the whole region in terms of being truly torn into two schools of thought. And when we look at what was going on in Nantucket economically at the time, it does make sense. As many people know, there were Quakers who were merchants who were dealing by trading whaling oil with England in return for important things like flour. And the very last thing that was something they would want to do was to break away from the mother country. On Nantucket, however, of course, there were people who did want to, and that really basically split the island into two schools of thought. And that persisted through a great deal of the period of the war. And of course, you can then look a few years afterward when Nantucket gave some thought to becoming a separate country. So that's all very different from Martha's Vineyard, for example, or Cape Cod itself, which was more clearly ultimately on the patriot cause.
And both Cape Codders were traveling all over the world on their ships, but also there's a large indigenous population on the Cape in places like Mashpee and other places. I want to talk a little bit about the role of the native people who were on the Cape at the time.
Yes, that's one of the aspects of our book that we're particularly proud of, and the fact that we had a member of the research team, Jack Duggan, who did extensive research into both African American and Native American participation, something which had not been done in this level of depth before. And one of the interesting questions is, well, which town on Cape Cod had the highest percentage of people who stepped up to join the militia? Not the highest number, but the highest percentage. And the answer to that question is Mashpee.
Hmm.
So then we asked the question, well, why would that be? And of course, the population of Mashpee being largely indigenous peoples would make sense in the sense that this would be seen as joining the revolution could be an opportunity to perhaps regain some of the land which they had lost. Unfortunately, from their point of view, that didn't work out, but that was something that was certainly the case at that time. And we have a couple of different essays that are on that. And then African American participation turns out is now being able to be well documented as a result of that work. And there were people who were formerly or were freed slaves who joined in the cause, and they've been identified by name as well.
Interesting. It's an interesting piece. We're talking with Ron Peterson and David Martin from the Cape and Islands Historians Committee, who have issued the Revolutionary War on Cape Cod at the Islands. And there is information here on how to order a copy. And you also talk a bit about people like James Otis. And Otis, of course, is famous for the writs of assistance, but then he comes from a very important Barnstable family. His father is the moderator of the town meeting. His brother's a captain in the militia. And we talk a little bit about, and there's a statue, I believe, of James Otis in Barnstable.
Yes, there is. And there's a statue of his sister, Mercy Otis Warren, as well. He Barnstable born and raised. I've spent a lot of time looking at the early antecedents of the Revolutionary War. We tend to think of 1763 as being when things really got started with the end of the French and Indian War and the decision by Britain to enact taxes and increase their control over the colonies. But there were a whole series of events that occurred before that were harbingers, canaries in the coal mine. And one of those was James Otis's speech to the court in opposition to the writs of assistance.
Yes.
The writs of assistance were it's kind of an archaic term. We would think of it today as search warrants. And these were part of an effort on the part of Britain to clamp down on smuggling, which was becoming a bigger and bigger issue. Actually going back to tea, the colonies were smuggling most of the tea they were consuming anyway. But this was a big issue. And writs of assistance gave British customs officials the right to conduct searches of people's homes, their businesses, their ships, their warehouses, anything at all, on an unlimited basis with no advance notice. And these writs, once issued, didn't expire. And the customs officials could deputize others to engage in this. This was really horrendous. And they were about to be renewed. The writs were about to be renewed. And now customs officials were stationed in colonial American ports. So this was a big issue. And James Otis Jr. was actually a judge in the Admiralty Court at the time, which would have enforced the writs of assistance. But he resigned that position, a very lucrative position, to represent a group of merchants that were opposed to the writs. And he rose in the court and gave a 5-hour speech, which was recorded by a young up-and-coming attorney named John Adams, and really established in that speech, in that 5-hour speech, a lot of the principles that formed the bedrock of revolutionary thought for the rest of the revolutionary period. The whole concept of a man's home as his castle, and the overreach and the unconstitutionality of this. And Otis, as much as he was a firebrand for the revolution, Otis really wasn't advocating separation or revolution, or he was advocating for the rights of colonists as British citizens under the British Constitution. Something that's sometimes misunderstood about Otis, but that was a bellwether, and James or John Adams was later to say that speech on the writs of assistance was that the revolution began then and there.
Right. Yeah. And then the senior Otis is a judge, and he's involved in an episode in the fall of 1774 when he tries to open the court. Can either of you speak to that?
Yeah, Ron, go ahead and take that one.
Okay. Yeah, that was as a result of the coercive acts that were passed after the Tea Party, which were really brutal. One of the many offensive provisions were that had to do with the appointment of jurors, and jurors were not going to be appointed by royal officials who were instead of under the traditional means where local people would be appointing jurors, and that was really raised a huge outcry, and there was a massive demonstration. People from Sandwich came down, and there was this massive demonstration in front of the court, and James Otis Sr. was the presiding judge at the time, and he agreed and closed the court in protest to the Administration of Government Act, which had all these provisions.
It's amazing to think about that moment. I'm just thinking back to the Somerset, because that also, the pumps from it, I'm told, that John Sears buys them. And that brings us to the story of salt becoming an important commodity on Cape Cod during the Revolutionary War.
Yes, that's an important part of the Somerset story. The British had succeeded in destroying the salt industry, which is a terrible blow because salt, of course, was one of the few ways of preserving food since there was no refrigeration. And by retrieving the bilge pumps, the huge ones from the Somerset, as you say, John Sears then was able to reconstruct the salt industry to a certain degree by once again being able to pump seawater into pools that then were, of course, evaporating and then leaving the salt again. And that continued. After the war, the salt industry on Cape Cod got superseded by some people in New York State who had succeeded in a less expensive method. But during the Revolution, that was a key event.
It was said, I think in the 1840s, you could walk from Barnstable to Provincetown along the beach on the salt works.
Yes. One other thing I wanted to just mention, taking off from what Ron brought about in reference to the John Adams statements. In 1815, John Adams, in his wonderful correspondence that we still have with Thomas Jefferson, was looking back on the Revolution, and he said the war was not the Revolution. The war was a consequence of the Revolution. The Revolution itself took place beforehand by, of course, the changing of opinions and ideas, and that the Revolution was a movement from what he called the middling classes, fishermen, farmers, and so on. And he makes that point very clearly as a historian looking back in 1815.
Yes, and you can see a lot of this happening on the towns on Cape Cod.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah, we're talking with David Martin and Ron Peterson of the Cape and Islands Historians Committee, and the book they've put together is The Revolutionary War on Cape Cod and the Islands, which really is a model for doing this kind of local history, which tells a much larger story. That is not simply an antiquarian look at what was happening in these places, but it ties it in with these broader currents. And the last section of the book is a series of biographies of different people who were involved in this. And I think we'd be remiss if we did not mention Isaac Snow, who is one of the subjects of biographies. If there are others you want to highlight, please do. But Snow stood out to me.
Yeah, Isaac Snow was probably has the most incredible story of any veteran that I've been aware of. He lived in what became Orleans. Orleans didn't exist at the time of the Revolution. It was the South Parish of Eastham, but he enlisted in the militia at a very early age. He went to Boston under Colonel Higgins of the Eastham militia, and was involved in the fortification of Dorchester Heights. His enlistment, and they were 6-month enlistments at the time. When it expired, he re-enlisted and went back to Boston, was involved in the siege. And he enlisted a couple of more times before he decided to change course and enlisted on privateers. And during his stint on privateers, he was actually captured twice.
Wow.
The first time he was captured, he was on a prison ship in Lisbon, Portugal, and he escaped, was able to escape and made his way across France. And during his traversing France, he became aware of the Duke of Orleans, who was a freedom-loving individual who supported the American cause. He was later executed during the Reign of Terror, the French Revolution. But Isaac was apparently very much enamored with him, and he made his way back to the colonies on a French fleet that was headed for Newport to support the American cause. And he walked back from Newport to Orleans, to the South Parish of Eastham, and then he enlisted on another privateer.
Wow.
and was captured again.
Wow.
And he was sent to a prison in London. And subsequently, he actually learned the shoemaker trade while he was in prison. Apparently, the prisoners had a program, since they had nothing else to do, they taught each other their trades. So he became a shoemaker then.
Wow.
And he ended up being returned to Eastham on a prisoner exchange right near the end of the war. And later, he opened up a shoemaker's business, very successful, ended up owning part shares of a windmill. And when Orleans was incorporated in 1797, he was appointed to a committee to come up with a name for the new town, and he suggested Orleans in homage to the Duke of Orleans. So he's really, even though Orleans didn't exist during the Revolution, he's kind of our link to all of the events that occurred.
Really is. It's a great story.
Yeah, it's almost beyond belief.
Yeah. There should be a movie about Isaac Snow.
Absolutely. That's a great idea. David, that's our next project.
How about you, David? What's any final words or thoughts for us, David?
Well, I think the most important thing is for people in general who have an interest in the revolution to realize, as we said before, that when you talk about the revolution, you immediately find coming to your mind Valley Forge, Lexington and Concord, Bunker Hill, and maybe Yorktown. When in fact, of course, on Cape Cod and the islands, there were important events and trends going on within the revolutionary period, and that we're trying to make inroads in that to inform the general public and to help people in the region to feel a certain sense of pride about that as well. So that would be my closing thought on that.
And you've done a great job. Ron, any final words for us?
No, but I think in terms of the early antecedents and the impact of Cape Cod on the transpiring of the events that led to the revolution, I've been intrigued by the idea that that revolutionary thought started on Cape Cod in Provincetown Harbor in 1620, when the Mayflower Compact was written. And I know that's controversial in terms. There are historians who disagree with that.
I'll tell you, it's not controversial in Provincetown.
No, I'm sure it's not. But that was the first instance in Western history where it was the first attempt to establish consensual government between individuals.
Right.
The signatories of that compact were pledging loyalty to laws that they would enact themselves and to leaders that they would elect themselves. That was way ahead of its time. Now, the degree to which that translated and was carried forward, I believe that it was influential. I know there are some historians who take different positions, but I certainly think it was considered. I know that it was considered foundational by early leaders like John Quincy Adams and one of our first American historians, George Bancroft, considered it to be foundational. So I think we on the Cape can look back to that and think, we were likely at least a partial cause of the start of the spark that led to that the revolutionary thought and the separation from England and independence.
Very true. Well, David, it looks like you had one more thought.
No, thank you. That's fine. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you both so much for joining us. This has been great. And we've been talking with David Martin and Ron Peterson from the Cape and Islands Historians Committee, and they have put together the Revolutionary War on Cape Cod and the islands, issues, events, and the people, which does tell many stories about Cape Cod and Nantucket and Martha's Vineyard and the Elizabeth Islands during these tumultuous years before and during the War for Independence. So thank you so much for joining us.
Well, thank you very much.
Writing the book.
Thank you very much, Bob.
Thank you.
And I want to thank Jonathan Lane, our producer, the executive director of Revolution 250. And if you have ideas for things we should talk about or want to get in touch with Jonathan, his email is jlane@revolution250.org. And every week we also thank folks in places who are regularly tuning in. And if you're in one of these places and want some Revolution 250 swag or just want to connect with Jonathan, send him an email, jlane@revolution250.org. And this week, in honor of the fact that we're talking about Cape Cod, we're thanking our friends in various islands and insular communities around the world. So this week, I want to thank our listeners in Taiwan and in the Faroe Islands, in the island of Malta in the Mediterranean, and the island of Ireland, the Emerald Isle, and in the Philippines. And so thank you all for joining us. And to all folks between and beyond, thanks for tuning in. And now we will be piped out as those Cape Cod militias did on the road to Boston.